Globe Up Talks is a series of conversations in which members of the Boston Globe editorial board interview thought leaders and unique voices. And today we have a stellar panel. Let me introduce you to them. We have Shireen Mitchell, who is the founder of Stop Online Violence Against Women. We also have Adrián Reina, the strategy director for United We Dream. And we have Yasmin Ulloa, national political reporter for the Boston Globe, who has basically not slept in more than a week. So thank you all for being here. And Yasmin, you must be like running on, I don't know what, but
No,
thank you.
30%.
Yes. So going into the presidential election, Black and Latino voters were targeted by disinformation efforts, both in English and Spanish. These efforts were driven mostly by right-wing groups in order to suppress these constituencies' votes or shift them toward Trump. And some of these efforts, unfortunately, may have been very persuasive. We saw it play out in Florida with Spanish-speaking misinformation, as my colleague Jasmine documented in one of the earliest news stories to report on this phenomenon. So today we're going to talk about some of the tactics seen during the 2020 election season, what the counter campaigns to address them look like, and why disinformation still matters post-election. So let me begin with you, Shireen. You've been in the tech space for a long time, designing bulletin board systems before the advent of websites, playing video games before they could be played on television. You were, in fact, the first woman of color in web management in 1997. And a few years later, you launched Digital Sisters to help women and girls of color get into the STEM field. So, what moved you to start Stop Online Violence Against Women in 2013, and how did that work lead you and other researchers to identify some of the disinformation tactics we are seeing today, even before the
Yes.
presidential election in 2016, 4 years ago?
Thank you so much. And yes, I've been in the tech space for quite some time as a little Black girl from Harlem, New York. Most people, the first response was like, you cannot possibly be good at tech or do tech or anything like that. So when I formed Digital Sisters, the focus was to make sure that, girls of color, girls that look like me, knew that they had a space here and to carve some of that space out. But one of the key things that we were doing was dealing with the way in which they were being treated in the fields. So by the time we got to, where I started forming Stop Online Violence Against Women, we saw this overarching framing of targeting Black and brown girls online. And we did the first survey that just basically said, what does online harassment and look like to women and girls of color? And so when we first started looking at that, that's when we started to discover these patterns, and that there was this consistent pattern of targeting, but also this consistent pattern of the ways in which it was also being used for discrediting. So some of that led us to what you will eventually see in 2016. I'll show you a little graphic about that. But what I try to do is try to explain to people why it has been so successful or persuasive, but also why it has been going on for so long, right in front of people's faces and noses, and they didn't do anything about it or didn't even know to do anything about that. And so one example I talk about, everyone knows about Gamergate, right? There's been multiple conversations. The media has been talking about, there's been years and decades of that. But before Gamergate was something called Donglegate, where a girl of color, woman of color in the tech field was speaking up against sexism in the tech industry. And she had a coordinated, targeted attack against her. The person who she was speaking about, went off into the industry, made more money, went to go work for another company while she had her job taken away. She was not able to get back into the fields right away. She had death threats. She had to move constantly over and over and over again. But no one cared that much about that story because it happened to be a main target of a Black woman. Actually, she was Black and Jewish. And so when you start moving into Gamergate, people are like, well, a lot of this started with Gamergate. No, it started before Gamergate. So while we were tracking Donglegate, we were tracking a couple of other things. There were groups of women who were watching accounts pretending to be Black women under a campaign hashtag called Your Slip is Showing, where they were identifying these fake accounts, identifying these people pretending to be Black women. And then we were also tracking other campaigns that were targeting Black women. So for example, Stop Black Girls was another example of targeting them to keep them and try to discredit them, to keep them from any kind of upward mobility or seeing them as credible. All of this was happening between 2013 and 2014. So by the time people caught on to Donglegate, or it took off, that was around 2015. So we're talking 2 years of this already going on. And then as we lead into 2016, because of those targetings, that the ways in which these things were targeting our community, and why I was tracking it, I was able to see other patterns that led up to the patterns that we finally see in 2016, where Russia was pretending to be Black people, but they weren't just pretending to be Black people, they were pretending to be other groups of people. That's what the whole troll farm thing is about. So I'm going to show you a really quick a visual about that, because when they turned in those 3,500 ads from Facebook, because they had used their platform to the Senate, and then there were other reports coming out, we put out the first report to say that there was no other group under attack and targeted more than African Americans in 2016. And here's why we said that really quickly. Now, after our report, other people decided to talk about this. So I'm just going to do a really brief synopsis here so you can see. We took those same 3,500 ads, we dumped them in a data visualization so that you could see a little bit better about what was really happening here. And as you can see, this web here is huge, right? It's all connected here. And you see all these outlying groups on the outside. So these are like link nodes, basically, topics and issues that are important. But if you see here, you can see how there's levels of intensity. So the red is sort of connected to each other, but you can tell what they focused on the most. And it's the simplest way to say it. So I'm gonna, sorry that I went out. Sorry. I'm trying to get in. So I'm gonna show you an example really quickly so you understand that this was not just the Black community, but as I zoom in here closer, you can see the level of intensity of this community group, right? See the names?
Yep.
We know what community this is. But if you know this, it's outside the web. It's not connected to the web at all. So what we ended up having to do is take a better look at the connections here. And when we started to see what the other groups were connected, I won't go into it because I don't want to take up too much time. But this is what we were able to see. Now, this was harder to see because of the level of intensity and how on top of it was. But you can see simple things like Black color, Pan-Africanism. But if I highlight one of these that they were majorly focused on, you can see African-American civil rights movement, again, the intensity of it, how almost all the numbers of these ads, the impressions, and basically their reach. So what we were trying to do is understand how they were using our identity to target. And this is just one synopsis. And so I did that so that people understand that's how come we knew where to start. And then by the time we started seeing what happened in 2016 and then now in 2020, we knew exactly what patterns to start looking at and what to pay closer attention to. And
So, oh, sorry to interrupt, but just to be clear, those incidents or those events that you showed in the graph were just tied to Russia, right?
This was just Russia in 2016.
Right.
Yes.
And so how, has this evolved since 2016? Tell us how that has developed. Like, has it become more sophisticated? Are there other actors,
Absolutely.
How have these campaigns evolved?
So the way I try to express this is that even now people keep talking about Russia, but the key is Russia did the original seeding of this. This was sort of seeded into our culture. Once the troll farm was discovered, a lot of the original tactics were sort of changed, and of course that's normal. That's what they would do because they got caught, right? So now they have to come up with new ways. But the ways in which we have seen it now is it's way more domestic, including coming from politicians, people in power, in offices, on this land, in this country, where all any foreign actors have to do at this point is to help false amplify it. Right. What they were doing back then was pretending to be us. So you would have one troll, one person who's basically a troll in the troll farm that was controlling at least 500 accounts, pretending to be a whole bunch of different people, but pushing the same storyline and same narrative. What has happened so some of those campaigns or top line campaigns still exist from 2016 and 2020. The difference is domestic actors are using those top lines. They're the ones amplifying and pushing out the disinformation that now all it takes is one or two little funnels of amplification.
Yeah.
And just really candidly, the man in office right now, he tweets the most, as everyone knows, but in many instances, up until recently, disinformation, right? Up until it was the election, did these tech companies take any actions on this? But if you actually do a search on those that are following him, and he gets upset about this, it's like 80%, almost 80 million of those that are amplifying his voice are inauthentic. They're not real people.
They're bots.
And so people don't understand the impact of this. So you take these one or two storylines, you get this amplification, and people believe it because they see it more often than not. They don't dig into the facts. They don't do their due diligence. So now we are in a disinfo culture. Almost everything we see or are exposed to is 6 times disinformation before it's facts.
Wow. So before we get into the how we combat this sort of thing that, like you say, is now coming, it's like the call is coming from inside the house.
Yes.
Right, like playing a bigger role, right? But Adrian, let me move, before we talk about solutions, let me move to you. As part of United We Dream Action, you have been working on creating counter messaging to address disinformation efforts in the Latino community. Tell us about that work. What did you start noticing this year, and when? And also describe what you mean by counter messaging. What does that look like?
Yeah, and thank you all, and thank you to the Boston Globe, for such an important conversation. United We Dream is the largest immigrant youth-led organization in the country. And sorry, my cat is going crazy. But here's the deal. Disinformation and misinformation among Latinx immigrant communities is nothing new. We have had to deal with false reports of such legalization, happened when it didn't, right? Reports of raids when it didn't. The amount of stress that creates in the community and the strain on community organizations to respond. So we've had to set up systems to fact check, right? To actually have a due diligence before we announce to the community, oh, hey, ICE is in your streets, because many times it's just word of mouth reports, well-intentioned people. But what is different about this is that what we've noticed is that there are external actors disguised, just as Shireen was lifting up, disguised as members of our community, building a following over time, and then beginning to share narratives that actually pit communities against each other. We saw a lot, this time around, we saw a lot of folks, external actors capitalizing on anti-Blackness among non-Black immigrant communities and turning and saying Black people are looting streets and everything, and this is all a Democratic-led effort. Similarly, we have seen external actors targeting Black folks saying, hey, we're descendants of slaves. Yet Democrats are out there but going to bat for illegal immigrants, like very politically charged stuff that has more to do with sentiment. So why did we have to intervene in this is several things. Number one is disinformation thrives where there is a lack of good information. And unfortunately, people, content producers, it's difficult to just constantly be producing the facts as something novel that people feel moved to share. But that is a cultural change that we're having to make happen. We're having to inform people how critical it is that you actually stop and think about the stuff that you're sharing. Take away the sentimental instinct of wanting to share something outrageous on your feed that then later turns out to be false. Number two is helping people have these conversations. I mean, Marcela, and I don't know if y'all know, but like I have heard several stories of people literally fist fighting within their families because they learned that they just cannot stand just how misinformed they are. Just yesterday, I got a text message from my mom. She lives in Texas, and I kid you not, she says, dead people ended up voting for Biden, just like all the Mexican presidents, like they are corrupt. And I'm like, I didn't even bother replying, quite frankly, because I understood that it was an emotional conversation, really not about facts. And again, that's the issue with disinformation. But that is why we want to create content that people can use to sort of educate themselves on how to have these conversations with your family members, with your friends, and not doing that online, because that elevates disinformation and misinformation, and knowing how to reach one-on-one. And lastly, we saw the impact, we see the impact of disinformation on democracy, period. And I think it's very important to note that as a society, we must grapple with the reality that this is new. Through this election, what we have seen is that social media is designed in a way, these products are designed in a way that are creating like a warped sense of reality for whoever it is that the user is in front of the computer, right? Like if you are someone who is constantly being bombarded with disinformation due to the algorithm, you are living in your own sense of reality, and that is causing people to do and act in ways that are constructed. And like Shireen said, there are people who know these vulnerabilities and they are taking advantage of these things. Yet we continue to see the lack of action at both elected officials stepping up and the platforms who are actually earning money by keeping people on social media screens, scrolling through, consuming this, and doing nothing about it. And that is why we think that it's really important that all of us, right, like step up to the plate and hold those people accountable.
Yeah. So I do want to go back or come back to this notion of pitting Black voters or Black people against Latinos. But before we get there, Adrian, let me dig in a little bit. I know that this is very personal for you. You just mentioned your mom. And can you talk a little bit about that? Has she sort of, oh, hi. has she, I mean, have you made any sort of progress in trying to have her be just exposed to better information? How do you deal with her in your personal life? Because I have heard from a lot of readers, from a lot of people who deal with this on a daily basis, and they don't know what to do. Like you say, they have fights, they have fist fights, they have cut off people from their lives, people who are part of their nuclear family members. And so this is very personal to a lot of people. So can you share your experience with your mom, and how do you deal with it?
Absolutely. I mean, I will tell you one thing. The first advice is do not engage in an argument with anyone in your family on social media. That already elevates, right? Like we're already engaging with the disinformation. It starts to spread. It creates a really antagonistic environment. Number two, reach out one-on-one, and like I've tried really hard to base it on values. So I know my parents are not bad people, right? Like they're not people with like bad intentions. I think that because we are in an environment in this world, they really are looking for meaning. They're looking for the truth. And when we are in a place of uncertainty as human beings, we want to look, but we've been socialized to think that we just do a couple of Google searches and find the answer, right? It's like such a joking thing. We even like ask Siri what the meaning of life is as a joke.
Yeah.
But the truth is that like we have to realize, right, that like everybody is receiving different different information to make meaning of this. And again, people know it. And I think I've tried really hard to bring attention to this to them. And I think for this is more complicated because there's like the whole son parent relationship thing, like telling them what to do and what not to do. So every family is different. I would say find someone who that person trusts, right? That will listen. Because if they don't trust you, they won't listen, and they're just gonna go further into a place where they're consuming this information.
Yeah, yeah. So Yasmin, let's talk about what your reporting has been showing, and what have you been seeing, or what did you see out in the trail leading up to the election. Were people running into this stuff? You know, in your reporting, you know, what did that show? You know, who the actors behind it were. Tell us about what you found out.
Yeah. So, man, a lot, really good speakers. You know, I started kind of tracking this on and off since I've been kind of tracking it on and off since 2016, and in 2018, to Shireen's point, you know, I was tracking down some of the pages that Facebook took down that were connected to Russian actors, you know, Black activists and Latino activists, you know, talking about immigration and even Black Lives Matter back then. And you know, I managed to track down some Latino activists who had appeared on this in this photo at this event in Los Angeles, in San Diego, at a park in San Diego. And so they were part of this. This photo appeared on this page, one of these pages, these Facebook pages that was taken down. It was called Aztlan Warriors, I believe. And so, you know, I took the photo and I was trying to track down who was in that photo and how did they get there. And so I eventually did track down two of the Latino activists who were down there, and they said, actually, I don't really know what this page is. They just kind of took my photo and they put it there. Like, I'm not really connected to this group at all. So I knew then that this was going to be a serious problem. We were seeing it a lot, you know, targeting Black voters, as Shireen said, but I knew that potentially that this was going to happen more and more, especially among Spanish speakers. I kind of had the inkling then that something was up. And so fast forward October 2019, in the middle of the Democratic primary, I'm in South Florida reporting on a story in a suburb of Miami called Doral, and I think that's when I noticed, okay, yeah, this is starting. These narratives are starting to take hold. And so I was working on a story looking at socialism, the specter of socialism, because in Florida, it's long been used by Republicans, largely Cuban American Republicans, to really rally their base. You know, fear of socialism. So here in the United States, on the American left, you know, you know, it's become the calling card of Bernie Sanders and AOC, and people see it as a positive thing, right? You know, a social safety net, talking about, you know, new ways to address healthcare and climate change and all these other issues, right? But in Florida, among Cuban Americans, among Venezuelan Americans, it conjures these images of fear, dysfunctional, you know, the countries from which they fled, you know, poverty, food lines. So it's become a dirty word. And so it's long been used to rally this base. And so even then you had Democratic consultants, you know, telling national Democrats, hey, you need to come in here and really invest in resources in counter messaging, because these narratives are starting to take hold that all Democrats are these radical socialists that are going to tear up the government. And even in talking to voters there, you had families like what Adrian was talking about. You know, you had Latinas, Venezolanas, you know, Venezolanas who had just become citizens, who were thinking about voting and were really concerned about the children who were getting separated from their parents at the border, and they did not agree with the immigration policy, but they still, you know, were really afraid about socialism. And their husbands, you know, like Trump, you know, there's all these other aspects to Trump, right? That you know, that appealed to his base, you know. So, but you were already starting to see kind of those narratives, and also narratives around immigration. You know, some voters I was talking to out in the street were saying, oh, I'm really concerned about the children, and I don't think that, you know, what the president is doing is right. But at the same time, like, there's criminals and terrorists coming through the border. Like, we need to stop that, and that there's no evidence of that. Yeah. So you were already trying to see that. And so again, so fast forward to the pandemic, and then that's when disinformation researchers were really like in a panic, because you have this perfect storm of uncertainty. You already have, you know, the disinformation, the misinformation that was spreading over the origins of the virus, the remedies, the symptoms, and you're seeing this coming from, you know, family in Mexico texting their cousins, oh, try this remedy, and this works, you know, and it's actually what, I can't pronounce the name of the chemical that the president was hydrochloric, yeah, and it's like, no, there's we that's still super preliminary, we don't know. And so it kind of, so they saw it, disinformation experts really saw it come in three waves: the disinformation over the coronavirus itself, then as we entered this moment of national reckoning over race and racism, a lot of the disinformation over the violent protest, the violent protests, because they were mostly largely peaceful. So a lot of that, and then we started to see we were already starting to see the beginnings of potential massive voter fraud, which is something that the president has been falsely claiming since 2015, when he launched his presidential campaign, when he was in the middle of his first presidential campaign.
Yeah. So let me go back to this pitting of, Black communities against Latino communities. Shireen and Adrian, both of you, this question is to both of you. In your experience, did that work? Was it effective, to pit these two communities? I mean, it's the old divide and conquer strategy, right? That has proven to be, successful through time. But have you seen any evidence of increased antagonism between the Black and Latino communities?
I think that I just want to make sure that we're clear about this. It's like it wasn't just between Black and Latino communities of this antagonism, this sort of riffing between us, which did happen, because I did see content being shared where African Americans was sharing content about the bad hombres, as well as seeing Latinos sharing content about these horrible Black male criminals. So those things happen, but also what happened, which we saw before Kamala became VP, we started to see more of the division between Asians, like she's Indian versus the South Asian versus the East Asian. We started to see more of that the closer and closer we got to the general election, when in places like WhatsApp and the like. So a lot of the individuals sharing between communities or groups, they were hijacking places that were supposed to be used to share information about COVID, and then turn it into an anti-Trump, not anti-Trump, but anti-Biden and anti-Harris framework based on their identities or based on certain aspects that they felt that they were taking. So Biden got the pedophile and socialist framing. Kamala got the identity framing, whether it was her Black identity or her Indian identity, and then her record as a cop, which she's not a cop. So they did the whole still doing the criminal spin on the criminal justice aspect. But there was, there's no way to get away from the concerted effort to go to try to pit one group against the other, and using the top ones that we tracked that was being used on the issue area basis was immigration, criminal justice, and I think what Adrian's trying to pick up is the conversations around reparations, which is about this descendants of slaves on this particular land. They were trying to dissect that down to you had to be a descendant on the ship had to land in America on the 13 colonies, and it couldn't land anywhere else, which also gave legs to dismissing Afro-Latinos. And so there was all these things that you could see that they were finding ways to sort of seed in to continue division. Now, I always say there's a reason, right? Like the way that the nodes and things I showed you, there's a reason that you keep groups outside of each other like that. We're just sending them different information. And the goal is to get them to believe that disinformation, so that when they do integrate with each other, the facts don't match. They don't land with each other. And there's also a lot of ahistorical narratives. So not understanding each other's history is also a good way to kind of seed in there and keep that division. So the void of the facts where the disinformation comes from. But the thing that I think that Adrian was harking on, which I think is really important, this is not new. We've always had versions of these debates within our communities. And you're absolutely right. It's a divide and conquer model. But I always try to remind people, if they're trying to divide us between each other that much, that we should be paying attention as to why. Because in my opinion, that means there's more of us than those that are trying to divide us.
Right.
The only way they can be successful is if they can see in there a little bit of doubt and a lack of trust and a disconnect to cultural narratives, then we're able to be susceptible to these things. Yeah. So I think there were instances where I was just like, babies in cages, y'all, babies in cages. And there were some people who was like, well, it's not our babies. What do you mean?
Right.
There's no relevancy into whose babies are. It's babies in, like, if you are trying to dissect which babies they are, then we fundamentally have failed.
Right.
And so those are the kinds of things that we did see in some of the movement to believing, in my opinion, a lot of the disinformation coming from the other party versus the facts.
Yeah. So Adrian, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Shireen and everything you've laid out. I mean, and you asked, was it effective? And you know, I want to be clear that like effective does not mean like if we're trying to think about this like it just was the arc, but the end of the arc was the election, right? Like we're kidding ourselves. The folks who are doing this work are doing this with a long-term strategy here. And here's the deal. They don't have to win like every single Latinx identifying person or every Black identifying person. What they are banking on is chipping away at the margins of support. And why that is effective is because Democratic operatives, other folks are making intentional choices of creating a vacuum. There is this assumption that like because we are like the Latinx community, that it's like monolithic and that like, well, you know, the polls are showing we still got the majority, sure, but this is a long game. We're talking about there's a whole generation that is incoming, right? That is absorbing information from online, that is interpreting the world in the ways that they're seeing their friends and their families talking about it. And without an alternative narrative that is grounded in facts and in our values, that's where disinformation actors can step in and make those gains. And so I wouldn't say that they were effective, right, in terms of like really delivering a punch in our communities, but I think that it was big enough in some places that we should be asking ourselves, number one, who is reaching out to our communities and talking to them, right? Are we reaching them in the right places? I mean, I can't tell you how many times folks in throughout the election, we kept saying like, does anyone or anywhere at any time going to like, men, particularly men, were being targeted at disproportionate rates in video gaming sites where like you could not let the amount of ads connected to disinformation campaigns that they were receiving were far outnumbered. And mind you, like those are spaces where folks are already in community, folks are already talking to each other. There's already so many social like ties and social layers of having to appear and conform to something specifically. So we are not out of the hole yet. We have to be reaching out to communities and we have to do it in an intentional way.
So let me drill into that because my next question ties very much into it. Right after the election, I saw a tweet, that was kind of like, it was made like a joke, but not so much. Perhaps it wasn't a joke, but it says something like Democrats need to get into the misinformation game since it's proven to be so, such an effective tool for Republican operatives. But the answer to misinformation, like one of you said earlier, is not more misinformation, it's just better information, right? So my question to you guys is, what is the role that the government can play, number one? What are some of the policy solutions we should be looking at this? I know that in Florida, because Spanish language misinformation was getting so intense, Congresswoman Debbie Mucarsel Powell and Congressman Joaquin Castro sent a letter to the FBI calling for an investigation into Spanish language misinformation efforts that, as far as I know, went nowhere. So what can Congress do? What can the government do? Also, is there a role the media can play? Because like you guys have, made very clear, there's a vacuum out there that is being exploited. What does the so-called mainstream media need to be doing more of to, provide better information to all these communities that are not getting it?
So I would say absolutely in the terms of the vacuum, the reason why the disinformation works because there's a vacuum there. I think the other piece of it is that in many ways media were participating in amplifying the disinformation, putting disinformation headlines, which got spreaded. That was being amplified more by Google and other algorithms. You put more of the disinformation in the headline, the more people see the disinformation and believe it, especially if it comes from reputable sources. I also believe, which is what we started doing as and we're doing now, almost every day we're looking at what the new disinformation talking points are, and we partner with Reality Team to come up with cards that counter the narratives, that tell you what, take the rumor, the reality, here's the truth, and then we give them sources that they can go to verify that, so they can use these contexts, use this content for context and share. So the more we can share and spread the disinformation, the better. But I do agree with Adrian. Do not argue with your family online. You have those conversations offline. But that doesn't mean you leave other conversations in void, right? If you see disinformation, we use the whole truth sandwich, where put the facts out there, debunk the disinformation, and put the facts out there again. You don't have to get into heated debates. All we're asking is to make sure that there's more factual information out there than disinformation. That's one step. The other thing is, we're saying this to the context of, you can do something about this. If the media fails us, if the platforms fail us, and the politicians fail us, we can take more actions ourselves, because we are the targets anyway. So if we take more steps to try to counter the disinformation ourselves, the more we can work at dispersing it. Because if we're depending on the government to do that, as we just saw, the government's participating. If we're depending on the platforms, I'm on the Facebook oversight board. We've been trying to hold them accountable for quite some time. We've been trying to hold them accountable for years to come, especially around political disinformation, right? They have taken upon themselves in many ways to not take down disinformation coming from people in power, like politicians, but they'll take down ours, right? If they feel like we violated something as a user, they'll take ours down, but they won't take down the politicians, which we find problematic. But so if they are not going to do it, right, we still have to, and we also still have to hold the platforms accountable. Then we have to depend on the media, making sure that that they're putting out the story. Like we teach people, read the headline. If you see a bad headline, don't share it. But if you see that the bad headline actually had the truth inside the story, and probably is in paragraph 3, because they bury the lead, grab the content that's the truth and share that. Don't share the disinformation in the headline. And so you have to now take a little bit of more due diligence about what you're looking at and what you're deciding to share. And like Adrian said, if you see content out there that that strikes an emotional chord in you, it doesn't matter what the emotion is, you take a pause and don't share it. You do some more digging and figure out what else is going on there, because there's a reason it's invoking an emotion. By the way, it's an intent. It's called reflexive control. It is an old psych ops weapon that has been used on us for years. It's just that it looks different when it comes to this disinformation. And then the other is that we focus strictly a lot on, which is, the work that we've been doing is trying to stop the digital vote suppression of this. These are the things that are being pushed out that are illegal. So when you see things, report it, like telling people to text their vote, that's illegal. It doesn't matter who, what, when, and where is doing it. Report that, get that down, make sure other people know. Don't amplify it, but make sure we get rid of that kind of stuff. We've still seen some versions of that, and we're seeing versions of that now with the stop the count and all these other things that are coming up. These are false narratives. Even when the Philly DA was putting out the truth, we didn't see more of the Philly DA's information than we did the people who were putting out the false narratives.
Right.
So we have to do more work. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Adrian, anything you want to add?
I mean, look, I think that there are levels. There's things that we can do at a personal level. One is really being conscious of our relationship to technology. It is a known fact that social media products are designed to keep you coming back. And to keep you coming back, you're gonna get served the stuff you want to be seeing, the stuff that piques your interest, right? So individually, we have to disrupt that. Like Shireen said, excited that platforms know, and they've been sitting on the fact that this is an issue. But I just want to lift something up. Like, social media products are not only being used in the United States, they're being used all over the world. I'm from Mexico. I have friends that come from all over Latin America. They come from all over the world. And I can tell you firsthand that social media products are at the core of spreading disinformation that actually has cost lives. The genocide that we saw in Myanmar, Facebook is directly complicit on the spread of intentional disinformation that led to the killing of people. And we have to not just think about this in terms of what is it that we're going to do to stop that product, but what is the responsibility that these companies have to society after having sat on this, on knowing that their products were having this impact and chose to do nothing about it. And number three, I think that government intervention is necessary. If I were Biden and the Biden transition team in this moment, I would be thinking very strongly about putting together the necessary task forces that are necessary to, one, understand how this is impacting, what are the business interests that are like allow for this environment to exist. And we really, really have to be asking ourselves, is this the world that we want? And if not, this is the time to put a stop on the business practices that lead to this. You know, conspiracy theories, I think that's going to be a thing for the rest of humankind history. You know, I don't think that we're going to get rid of that, but we certainly should not have something so widely used out there that allows for the spread of that and for it to have the impact it has today. We have to demand accountability, and we have to demand that our government do its job and actually represent the interest of people.
Yeah. So we're running a little bit behind here. So I want to get into the Q&A or the questions that were submitted by the audience. They were very good questions. It was really tough to pick, but there's a couple that I really want to pose to all the three of you. And one has to do with the monitoring that is happening with misinformation in Spanish. How much of that is happening you compare to misinformation campaigns in English? Because I feel like we saw some reporting, like Jasmine reported in other media, what was happening in Florida, in South Florida, with some radio stations that were, you know, spewing misinformation, anti-racist messaging, anti-Black racist messaging. Also with the insert in El Nuevo Herald, those were incidents that sort of jumped to the mainstream. But what about all the other things that we don't know? How much monitoring is happening? What can we do about that?
It's really hard. I mean, I was talking to groups about this. You know, there's grassroots groups like United We Dream and Shireen's group who are actually monitoring this, but it's really hard, especially in Spanish. You know, I think even some longtime Latino advocacy organizations that have been working on voter suppression efforts for a long time are barely transitioning into that, and sometimes they only have like one person trying to track, you know, this type of material in some communities. So it's really hard. And then going back to what Adrian was saying about this long game, just remembering that it is coinciding with the rise of, you know, global authoritarianism, and especially in Latin America, like a lot of these narratives are coming from, you know, we've seen them rise in countries like Colombia, you know, where you know, the peace accord in 2016, the vote over the peace accord between FARC guerrillas and the government, you know, there was a lot of polarization and disinformation going on around that, and it was because there were provisions in there to create more protections for women, Indigenous women, and LGBTQ members. So it's part of that same kind of strain, you know, the strain of values. Like if we're talking about what kind of world we want to create, that's you know, that's, we have to be aware that this is like a global rise in these types of narratives. So
that's the overarching goal here, to disrupt those.
Yeah, and then just one more thing that I wanted to add, because you asked about the effectiveness of it. I mean, you could kind of see that with the everything that we're talking about, with just the how the Latino vote is breaking down, and this is all preliminary, based on preliminary data, and who knows, like we're still going to have to wait for the actual numbers. Sure. But you're already seeing you know, Biden won overwhelmingly. Biden and Harris ticket won overwhelmingly in Latino communities, and in some of these states that flipped. Well, in Arizona and in Georgia too. There's evidence to show that, you know, Latinos came out overwhelmingly. But Trump really gained in shares of voters in certain places like South Florida and South Texas. And again, South Texas, you know, in these communities, I don't know, you know, I'm from Texas, I'm from El Paso. Like, so I've been hearing all my life, like Latinos don't vote. And And it's because campaigns don't reach out,
Right.
you know, and then campaigns don't reach out, Latinos don't vote. So we get kind of stuck in this perpetual cycle. And this was the first year that we saw, you know, Latinos coming out in record numbers. But still in these communities that, you know, for really there have been these historic deficiencies, historic disenfranchisement, like that. I think that's where you really saw this type of material work on people.
Yeah. So this question it's actually very interesting. I think it touches on something that you, Adrian or Sharon, I can't remember who of you mentioned, looking at specifically Black male turnout for Trump. Was there anything or any subgroup of that demographic that was targeted towards them specifically that you saw, Shireen? Black males, or even you said, Adrian, Latino males. You mentioned the gaming, or Adrian mentioned the gaming component, but was there anything else there?
Yeah. So Adrian was right about this thing about the margins. It was clear coming from 2016 to 2020 that the ability to try to sort of pull some of the Black men off of the line of the margins was a campaign tactic, particularly coming from the Trump campaign. We saw many versions of that. You saw them trying to come up with policies that were attracting them. Of course, they were trying to use Black celebrities as a way to do that. I thought, you know, for those that didn't see all the debate that was going back and forth between Ice Cube and 50 Cent, they were going after and targeting celebrities because they had a bigger following to get them to convince them to come over to their side. So they were private meetings, throwing Kanye West on ballots. There were Republican operatives who were throwing Kanye West on ballots so they can sort of stave off some of that Black vote in certain states. So yeah, was there targeting? There was there was a concerted effort to go after Black male votes. So that wasn't just from the disinformation part that was also being spread, but it was definitely sort of active, operative activity as well. And I don't think, in my opinion, and this is the part that I think Jasmine was talking about, that by the time that the Democratic Party was trying to come up with a solution to act, the disinformation was already settled. You can't come later trying to say, oh, that you got the wrong information, when your chances are in the beginning is when people are being fed the information in the first place. And that to me was probably the weakest part of what Adrian is talking about. This is not over. This is just, we have this marker and this thing is going to keep going. So if we decide to throw our hands up because we got this win, this is the sort of grabbing at the margins while we're not looking is going to continue to be going on. And the reason, of course, as you know, again, the reason why we focused on Black women so much is because they do change elections in this country. We've seen that. And so why else would they not try to pretend to be them in a way to try to garner wins?
To steal their power.
Yes.
Right. So we're running super behind, but I do want to ask you for some parting words. And I mean, there was a lot of interest, from audience members to know what can they do to anticipate particular misinformation campaigns in order to block them. Like, give just a very short sort of, suggestion or advice to people to try to counter misinformation campaigns. As a parting words type of, to end this talk on a more positive or hopeful note, I guess. You can go first, Yasmin.
Why me? No, I mean, I guess it is heartening to see that despite, all these things, we did see record turnout, 50-year record turnout, in more than a century. And there's greater civic participation than I've ever seen. There's in the Latino community, even in El Paso, there are people talking about politics that I never even, friends of mine that are paying attention now that I didn't think would, and so I think that those would be my closing words if we're looking for.
Yeah, it should give us hope that, if anything, this is getting even more intense because we are, reclaiming more of our power, I suppose is a good way to put it. Adrian, do you have any advice?
Yes. I think that if the holidays are coming up, have these conversations with your friends and family, talk about your use of social media, what are the sources of information you have, talk in community about this. If you need resources on how to have these conversations, we have some resources from United We Dream, from many other partners, and you can text this info to 877-877 to receive updates and be added to our WhatsApp group. So if you are in the family WhatsApp chat, this is
Say that again.
where to
Text
share
this
it.
info to
This
what
info
number?
to 877-877.
87. I'm doing it right now. All right. And so do you also have a WhatsApp group?
Yeah, in this
Awesome.
WhatsApp groups, we send blast out, shareables, things that you can post on your own social media, particularly that are counter narratives to disinformation narratives that we're seeing and monitoring. And also we share resources about just how to have these conversations with people and kind of how to use social media responsibly in this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Sherry.
Yeah, so for us as well, we don't have a text campaign, but we do have a Stop Digital Voter Suppression project that we'd love for people to join. To sign on, go to our website. You can find it with stopdigitalvotersuppression.net. Where we're asking people to help report what they see. I think there was a question about archiving. Yes, we're archiving, monitoring, collecting. Help us do that better by reporting and sending us information. We have a team that constantly monitors on a state level what's going on. So if you want to help us do that as well, that's something that you can take your own, steps to help us with. But we're also still working with partnerships with organizations like United Your Dream and others, Move On, to help us keep this kind of thing going on, so that we don't just think it's just about the election. This campaign that we're doing, this project, is going to be going on as long as we have elections. So join us as a partner, become a member. If you can't sign on from your organization, but you can sign on as an individual, definitely let us, do that. We send out newsletters and updates about the work so they can see what some of the things we're doing. Help us share our reality cards. Let that be amplification so that the real information gets out there about some of these issues. So, just definitely there are actions that you can take outside of the ones I shared earlier, by working with us and sort of getting ready for the next steps.
Great. So stopdigitalvotersuppression.net.
Yes.
You can go. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. This concludes our Up Talk today. Thank you. Thank you so much to the three of you for your valuable expertise and insight. And thanks for the great work that you do. And to our audience, thank you so much for your viewership. We will be posting this recording later so you can share it. And also please visit bostonglobe.com/opinion/uptalks to stay updated on our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.